Good morning, everyone. Let's hope the rain holds off, but we can sit in the rain if we have to. My name's Victoria Purman. Welcome to day 5. Just a couple of announcements before we get started with Tony. Would you please turn your phones to silent? If you're tweeting or Instagramming, the hashtag is hashtag ADLWW. People who can't be here love it. If you do, keep them informed that way. And there'll be a book signing at the end of the session. You know the drill. Get there quick because there's going to be a queue. I'd like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. I would also like to mention the garden. The Pioneer Women's Memorial Garden was built in the late 1930s to celebrate the achievements of pioneer women in the first 100 years of South Australian history. It stands now as a symbol for women of all ages and nationalities, many of whom have overcome isolation and loss to establish families and thriving communities in our state. We thank the trustees for their support of this event. We'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Government of South Australia through Arts South Australia, Heritage SA and the City of Adelaide Council for their generous support. You might be wondering where Heather Rose is since there's only two of us on stage this morning. Unfortunately, Heather, through ill health, can't be here today, but she has sent a message which she asked me to read, and I'm really delighted to do so. Hi, dear Adelaide Readers. I'm so sorry not to be there with you today. It's been something of a dream to one day get to Adelaide Writers Week, but I'm delighted to leave you with Victoria and Tony. I've loved reading Tony's 2 novels in preparation for this event and highly recommend them. For fans of Bruni, there's some interesting overlap with politics, spies and the thriller genre, which we are going to interrogate, don't worry. Thank you to all of you who've made Bruni a bestseller. I'm so appreciative and I hope to see you all another time in Adelaide. There is a downside to Heather not being here, but the upside is we get 1 whole hour with Tony Jones, who doesn't really need any introduction, does he?
Thanks for so much of you for coming out in this inclement weather. It's really a delight to be at a free festival. Adelaide is brilliant in that regard. So
yes.
Thanks for very unusual in the world these days.
Of course, we know Tony is the long-time host of Q&A, but he is a former foreign correspondent, a multiple Walkley Award winner, and now best-selling author of 2 novels, The 20th Man, released last year?
No, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. And his new book, In Darkness Visible, which we'll be discussing today. Please welcome Tony Jones.
Thank you.
We feel like we know you, Tony, or you've been on our screens and the airwaves for a very long time. But can I take you back to a time before you were at the ABC? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a very suburban suburb near Manly in Sydney. It was called Balgala Heights. Heights was very important to my parents. Ordinary old Balgala, not quite good enough. But it was just a very plain suburb. It was a great place to grow up. You could run around. There were beaches nearby. You could ride bicycles. Actually, my mother refused to buy me a bicycle. She thought they were too dangerous. So while my friends were going around on bicycles, I was on this ugly little scooter. But it was a great suburban neighbourhood with bush around it, the beach nearby. And it was a lovely place to grow up, as most of Australia is, actually.
Were you a surfer if you lived near the beach?
I was a very poor surfer. Yeah, I was a body surfer, yes. But, climbing onto boards, somehow my physique didn't quite work with that.
Too tall, maybe?
Probably.
And
too unfit, I suspect.
And thinking back to that childhood, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I didn't have a clue, to be honest with you. And in fact, I didn't really get a clue until I was at university and at University College. I went to a speech by a famous writer in those days and a foreign correspondent called Francis James. Francis James was a fabulous lefty, opposed the Vietnam War. He'd been in the Second World War. He'd been a Spitfire pilot, actually, for the RAF, so he was in the Battle of Britain. So he wasn't exactly a pacifist, but he was hugely against the Vietnam War, and he managed to become a foreign correspondent, went to China, did a series of stories about the Chinese developing nuclear weapons when he was living in Hong Kong. The Chinese arrested him the next time he went into the mainland and put him in jail for 4 or 5 years, accusing him of being a CIA spy. So Francis James had this incredible experience of living in solitary confinement every day. He had to get up in the morning, dig a ditch, the same size as his body, which he assumed was going to be a grave one day, and at the end of the day had to fill it back in and go back into his cell. And that's how he spent years and years and years, until his old college friend, a guy called Gough Whitlam, came to power in 1972 and decided to recognise the one China, and he made a deal with the Chinese when he did that, that for the recognition he'd get a few concessions, and one of them was to free Francis James from prison. So a few years after that, 4 or 5 years after that, he came to speak at my college, and he very kindly, when I got into an argument with him later, said, "You need to come and see me and speak some more, because you really don't know what you're talking about." And he brilliantly, I turned up on his doorstep the following Sunday morning. He'd completely forgotten, but he invited me into his house and sat there and gave me a tutorial for the entire day on our region, the politics of our region, the political machinations, the American interference, his own knowledge of local political leaders, and he gave me a pile of books, and I left his house determined to become a foreign correspondent, which ultimately I did. So
his 5 years in solitary confinement didn't put you off that idea at all?
You mean the idea of solitary confinement, or the idea of going to China? We should be in China now, as a matter of fact. My wife and I, Sarah Ferguson is down the front here, is going to be the ABC's bureau chief in Beijing, but the pandemic has caused a bit of a delay in our plans. So we hope to be in China soon.
He would probably be really fascinated to know that you've come that full circle, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. If he were alive, I'd love to sit down and chat with him and actually thank him. And when I come to events like this, I usually thank him in a way, hoping the message gets to his family.
Yeah.
Because I'm very grateful that someone would do something like that, that would take that kind of trouble. And he's the person who set me on the path that led me to where I now am. So I have to kind of, every time I talk about my career, I have to thank him in a way.
So how did you go from that conversation with Francis James to a journalism career?
So I finished, I did a degree which was pretty patchy and ended up being an honours degree in social anthropology. And I had a teacher's scholarship, but I quickly learnt that probably wasn't my destiny. And unlike my father, by the way, who's a mathematics teacher and a best-selling author, because he wrote mathematics textbooks, and brilliantly wrote them from kindergarten all the way up to high school. So he did very well out of writing. Thank you very much. But when I started looking around for an actual job, I discovered that teaching wasn't going to be for me, but I found a job on a suburban newspaper as a very low-grade journalist in Campbelltown in the outer west of Sydney, or southwest of Sydney. And it was a place that had become, it was a little country town, and suddenly they decided, that is the state government in its wisdom, decided to move everyone who was on social welfare and living in public housing, pretty much 80 or 90% of those people who were in the city, move them out to the outer suburbs. And so this place had terrible growing pains. It ended up being a great place for a journalist. And I went into the editor of my, when I was applying for the job, a guy by the name of Charles Spiteri, who again I'm also very grateful for, because he gave me my first job as a journalist. And I said to him, "What you really need here is a social anthropologist." Somehow he bought that argument. I don't know why.
It's often. Do you mention that story to any young journalists or student journalists now about the importance of doing that kind of really ground level work as a journalist?
I do. Yeah, I think anyone who these days is actually increasingly difficult to get into journalism at all at any level. The ABC is still taking trainees, but very few. And I always say, look, I got my start on a local newspaper, and there are local radio stations, and there are community radio stations, and all of these places. I mean, lots of people do now journalism degrees where they get some kind of actual training, but that didn't exist when I was at university. And but they still need to go and do the actual work of being a journalist. And starting on a local newspaper was fantastic, actually, because there were huge dramas going on all the time. And there was a sort of huge drama that happened. I could give you a very brief précis of it at some point, but it's the drama that led me to get into the ABC.
Oh, come on, tell us quickly.
Okay, so the town planner in Campbelltown was found one day unconscious outside the council chambers, having been beaten on the back of the head with a brick. Prior to that, there'd been a very heated council discussion because he had allowed, as the town planner, the development of a brothel 2 doors down from the council. The council chambers, I should say, and it was a very controversial thing to do, and people assumed he'd been paid off. And there we find him sort of unconscious, and the story begins. He comes to, he's taken to hospital, put under police protection, and says, it was the mafia that made me sign the documents to allow the brothel to be built in the same street as the council. So I was under duress, and now they've done this to me. It's terrible. And it did seem quite terrible. It seemed so terrible that all the major current affairs programs on television sent their helicopters in looking for the mafia in Campbelltown. Luckily, I was already there, and in the neighbouring newspaper associated with the same group, the Liverpool Leader, I think it was called, there was a guy who rang me up, another young journalist, who rang me up and said, "Look, I think I've found the mafia guy at the heart of all of this." And so we go out together to a little suburban street, and there's a Polish guy living in a little brick veneer house, and he puts down the Venetian windows as we arrive because he's actually expecting a SWAT squad to come and arrest him at any time for the anti-corruption, anti-mafia police. And he's got 3 or 4 of his working girls sort of in the house with him, and they're sort of doing their nails, and we ask him whether he's part of an organised crime syndicate, and one of the girls pipes up and said, "Oh, Tavlevsky, organised crime, he couldn't organise himself to do up his shoelace." And actually I got to believe that after a while talking to him. So we did the front page story called Tavlevsky Talks, I'm Not Mafia. And he really wasn't. He was just a low-level guy, wanted to run a little business on the side, made a terrible mistake. The next day or a couple of days later, I had my interview for traineeship at the ABC. And as I drove into Sydney on the radio that morning, on the AM radio program, the lead story is the mafia comes to Campbelltown. And they asked me to, in the interview, can I please assess their program that they've just had on in the morning? And I said, yes, well, your first story was wrong. And I kind of proved that to them, and the coming days proved it to them as well, because it turns out the town planner in his hospital room, poor fellow, he got himself into such a pickle. There was a policeman outside the door, and he was on the 3rd or 4th floor of the hospital, locked windows, and the policeman hears a strangling noise and rushes into the room, and there he is with his shaving cord wrapped around his neck, and he said, "The mafia's tried to strangle me." And as I often say, the policeman was not Poirot, but he did figure it out pretty quickly. Turns out this guy made up the whole story about being beaten over the head with a brick. He hit himself with the brick. He just had a bit of a panic. Anyway, as a result of his panic, I ended up getting a job at the ABC. So
never let the facts get in the way of a good story.
As I tell young journalists, you need a bit of luck along with everything else.
So how quick was the journey from that traineeship to postings overseas?
About 3 years later, I ended up working for the Four Corners program. So I got recruited into the Four Corners program. They wanted some young people. Back in those days, I was young. I had long hair and a mullet. And somehow or other, that seemed like a kind of fashionable alternative to their current crop of, elderly, grey-haired reporters. So they brought me into the Four Corners program, and sometime after that, I met the guy who led me on the course to writing these books, actually, because he was, I guess you'd call him Australia's version of Simon Wiesenthal. He was a Nazi hunter, and he was working in the ABC, in the documentary unit of the ABC. In fact, he ran the documentary unit in radio for the ABC. His name was Mark Ahrens, and he was the son of Laurie Ahrens, who was the head of the Australian Communist Party for many, many years. And Mark, it's a Jewish family, and Mark had taken it on himself to do something about the fact that an awful lot of Nazis had arrived in Australia in the period after the Second World War, unnoticed or noticed by our intelligence services and thought to be useful assets. So Mark when I went to see Mark for the first time, thinking this would be a good Four Corners story, knowing that he was working on this, he was in this wonderful old building that no longer exists in Forbes Street, quite close to King's Cross. And he had this little office, and it was absolutely full of these ancient filing cabinets. And he'd open the drawers, and each of the filing cabinets had maybe 10 or 13 files on different Nazis who'd come to Australia. There were hundreds of them, hundreds of files. And he was making a documentary series for radio called Nazis in Australia. I ended up doing the Four Corners television version of that, and it led me to take a huge interest in the Ustascha, which is maybe the most awful of the kind of fascist groups operating in Eastern Europe, aligned to Adolf Hitler during the Second World War, responsible for the most hideous, monstrous crimes you could possibly imagine. And, they actually recorded their crimes, many of them with black and white snaps, and you can find them on the internet today. I found them then, and I was so horrified it made me sick to the pit of my stomach. And then the prospect before me that someone who'd done these kind of horrific things, I'm talking about sawing off the heads of your religious enemies with a two-handed saw and slashing their throats, in huge numbers. They actually, within their concentration camp, Jasenovac, they created these knives with curved blades that strapped onto their wrists so that they could industrially cut throats. I'm sorry to be, ruining your morning like this, but these were the sort of images that I saw, and I knew that people who'd done such things had come to Australia, and I was horrified by that. So the story that we did and the stories that Mark did through his documentaries were very powerful as a result of all of this information that he had gathered mostly, and they led the Hawke Labor government to set up something called the Special Investigations Unit, examining whether it was true that Nazis had come to Australia. And it led to the first ever war crimes trial in this country. And the correlation of this is that a whole bunch of Australians, lawyers, police, researchers, judges, had got themselves experience in doing war crimes trials, which is very unusual throughout the world. And when the wars rekindled in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, and they set up a war crimes tribunal to deal with the horrific crimes that reminded everyone so much of what had happened in the Second World War. So they set up this war crimes tribunal in The Hague, and an awful lot of Australians who'd worked on the war crimes trial in Australia were recruited to go and work in The Hague. So you had judges, lawyers, you had a homicide detective called Bob Reid from New South Wales, who's still there, by the way, and who in recent years arrested two of the biggest war criminals in the former Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic, a name you might remember, and General Mladic, who was largely responsible for the Srebrenica massacre. Bob Reid, former New South Wales homicide detective, arrested them himself. So all of this, I believe, stemmed out of this extraordinary work by Mark Ahrens. So Mark Ahrens has been an inspiration to me in writing these books and as a journalist from my earliest days at Four Corners.
Can we go back?
That was a long answer, wasn't it?
No, I'm just listening. Can we go back to the Ustascha and World War II? I mean, it's a bit of history that I wasn't really familiar with. I hadn't heard the name, hadn't heard that they were more vicious than the Nazis. Can you go back and talk about that a little?
Yeah, the SS, who was sent, they were aligned with Adolf Hitler.
So they're Croatians?
The Croatian, the independent state of Croatia, it was called, was not independent because it was only allowed to come into power with the support of Mussolini and Hitler. They were basically puppet governments, many of the governments in Eastern Europe, and in particular this one. The leader was a guy called Ante Pavelic, who'd set up a terrorist organisation called the Ustascha in Italy during the period leading up to the Second World War. So he was sitting waiting to be placed into Croatia. And that's exactly what happened. And his government had a written policy of making the place, that is, making Croatia and their vision of the greater Croatia, a kind of unified Catholic state comprising only of Croats as opposed to the Serbs and Muslims who lived there. And so they had a policy of expelling, with the Serbs, of expelling 1/3 of them, that is, throwing them out of the country, of converting 1/3, that is, converting them from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism, and killing 1/3 to encourage the other two outcomes. So they set about doing that in the most vicious ways possible. And even the SS, their SS overlords, were horrified and wrote constant reports back to Berlin, which still exist. I've read some of them, saying, this is impossible to stomach. We can't keep working with these guys. They're too vicious. Anyway, as it transpires, we end up with a number of people who were in that cadre around Pavelić, including one guy who was a bodyguard to Pavelić, who come and live in Australia. And in Australia, because they're fiercely nationalistic, they set up their own nationalistic organisations, designed around the principles of the old Ustasha, not called the Ustasha, because that would be illegal, since the Ustasha were deemed to be war criminals. So they're called the Croatian Brotherhood. But they had exactly the same principles. They had mafia-like laws, which meant that if you became a member of the Croatian Brotherhood, you had to swear a blood oath to your comrades, that if you ever informed on them or anything they did, you could be put to death, and many of them were killed by their comrades for informing to the police or so on. So you got in Australia cells developing. That, in a way, they're kind of our first major terrorist group in Australia. And they set up and train people to go back to the former Yugoslavia from Australia. They give them military training. They send them back in 3 separate groups in the 1960s and 70s to try and overthrow the communist regime of Tito. So you have armed men in Australia who got their training, their military training in Australia, who are supplied with weapons bought with money from Australia, who infiltrate themselves inside the former Yugoslavia and try to foment a kind of revolution against communism. Some would say, in fact, these days they're heroes in Croatia, these people, because they were trying to fight against Tito's communist regime, which the Croatians today regard as a great evil. And so it's interesting how their history has come around in a full circle. They were foreign fighters, we would call them that now, and the very first foreign fighter laws came into play in Australia as a result of these guys. And indeed, in the lead up to the 1972 election that Whitlam won, we were talking about Whitlam a short time ago, in the lead up to that, in June of 1972, there was the last of those incursions into Bosnia. These guys, there were 20 or 21 of them. I think there were 20 of them, in fact. Sorry, that's why my book is called The 20th Man. So 20 Australian Croats and a number of other Croats from European countries join to go over the border from Slovenia, from Austria into Slovenia, and then they hijack a truck and they go into the mountainous regions of Bosnia, where in more recent years we've seen terrible fighting as well. And they try to set up a kind of revolution against communism. They're heavily armed. They're carrying with them cyanide that they managed to get from the Ford factory in Melbourne. And they sewed that up inside a koala bear, incidentally. And they were going to put that into the water supply in Belgrade, but they never quite made it there. They end up getting trapped on a mountain in Bosnia. And the whole of the group is ultimately killed. Some of them are killed in quite vicious fighting with local territorial army forces. And some of them are arrested and interrogated and then executed. It becomes quite a big issue in the Australian Parliament. Once again, a bit of a forgotten issue. It becomes quite a big issue in the Australian Parliament at the time. And the Labor side of the Parliament is starting to come up with the idea that these people are able to do this because they're connected up to ASIO, and our security services are helping them to do it. And that leads to a whole series of events which are spelled out in my first novel.
Yes, called The 20th Man. I highly recommend. I just want to talk to you a little bit about what struck me really, and I mentioned this unknown history to me. So many migrants, and I'm from a migrant background, came to Australia wanting a fresh start. They wanted to put those enmities behind them, leave it all behind. What was it about the Croatians that meant they could not leave it behind?
Well, first of all, we're not talking about all Croatians. We're talking about a small minority of Croatians. Well, the key here is the war criminals. You have a group of incredibly motivated men, a small group, who had fought in the Second World War, who had done, in many cases, horrific things. One of them ran something called the Mobile Court-Martial in Bosnia. He was based in Sarajevo, a Croat living in Sarajevo. He joined the Ustasha at the beginning of the Second World War, and he's partly responsible for the roundup of the Jews in Sarajevo. They had a thriving Jewish community. It was completely obliterated. And then he takes a group of people basically with a gallows around the country, arresting enemies and killing them on the spot in mock trials. This guy ends up being the main leader. His name is Srećko Rova, and he becomes the main leader based in Melbourne of the Croatian Brotherhood. But that's his background that Mark Ahrens uncovered through detailed research and found the documents of the Ustasha documented their own crimes and who was here and who was what. And you can find in the Ustasha newspaper of the time, which we did, reports of the mobile court-martial and how many people they killed that week. And the leader of the mobile court-martials there in their little headlines, Srećko Rova, he comes to Australia. And that's why I think it's easiest to understand how you got such passionate little groups or cells emerging when you had people like that leading them.
Barnaby Joyce recently has talked about the spies in Australia from China, Iran, Russia, but I was sort of really stunned to think that we had Yugoslavian spies in the 70s in Australia.
Well, actually, that's true. We had Yugoslavian spies, that is to say, members of the Yugoslavian Secret Service here in Australia, trying to hunt down the Croatian Brotherhood guys. Yeah. And they did it. There were murders that happened from time to time, and some people believe that the Yugoslavian spies are the real culprits behind some of the bombings that happened. That's probably not the case in the key bombing that we know of that happened in September of 1972. And you talk about ripped from the headlines. Okay.
We have them.
Everyone's forgotten about this, or most people have. I don't know if you can see this. People in the front can see it. This is a headline from September 17, 1972. Shoppers hit by bomb blast, terror in Sydney. There were two Yugoslavian travel agencies that were blown up on either side of, well, actually one was blown up and someone bravely discovered the bomb, and the second one and put it out in a street. But there were attacks on two Yugoslavian travel agencies, and the Croatian Brotherhood had been already made several attempts to blow up these travel agencies. And on this particular day, happened to be the Rugby League Grand Final day, Saturday the 16th of September, and as a very young man I was sitting in the Sydney cricket ground watching or waiting for my team Manly to actually win the Rugby League Grand Final.
Did they?
And meanwhile, they did win, yes. Here it says on the same front page, bubbly for Manly League champs. Anyway, that's how long ago it was. But anyway, everyone's forgotten about these bombings. But when I was doing my research into the Ustasha, we found that these bombers were actually, they were never, by the way, arrested or found. So we should say that. So in my novel, part of the invention, the novelistic invention, is to create the people who did this and to understand their motivations and follow a particular family from these events through to Yugoslavia and the conflict that happens in the early 1990s.
So that is how the 20th Man begins, the very first few pages with the bombing, and then the story unravels from there. It's just a brilliant backstory to create a thriller about, isn't it?
Well, I should say this. It sounds like these are terribly journalistic. You know, both the stories are, in a sense, conventional thrillers in that they lead up to kind of cliffhanger endings. The first one leads to a kind of Day of the Jackal style assassination attempt on the visiting Prime Minister of Yugoslavia. That's based on real events. And the second one sort of ends with, a huge, well, let's say huge, we're in Yugoslavia during the conflict, and the people who are responsible for the terrible things that happen all come together in a kind of conflagration at the end. That's probably the best way to put it without doing
no
a spoiler.
spoilers, that's right. But it's a fantastic background, and it is a page turner because these events were actually so interesting, so seemingly unbelievable but true.
Yeah. So I was trying to think about, because I'd lived through reporting on these events and looking back at this history, and so I was trying to figure out a way to make it into a novel that actually worked with characters that hopefully you believe and are sympathetic with. So I created a kind of, let's say, Romeo and Juliet style romance in which the man I was telling you about before, Mark Aarons, let's say the left side of his brain, the female side, becomes a character called Anna Rosen, whose father is senior figure in the Australian Communist Party, and she's got all the kind of skills of an investigative journalist and works at the ABC at the beginning. And she's unravelling all these events. But when she's at university, it happens that she falls for a quite romantic Croatian guy who happens to be the son of one of the key Croatian war criminals. His name is Marin Kadic, her name is Anna Rosen. It's a sort of Romeo and Juliet story that spans 2 books and more than 3 decades. And in the second book, she believes, incidentally, that Marin is no longer with us, and then discovers, amazingly, that he's actually under a different name, sitting in the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, awaiting trial for war crimes. And she goes to investigate.
Would you like to read some of the... Now, do you want to set up the scene you're going to read for us?
All right, so I did report on the wars in Yugoslavia, and as a correspondent based in London, I spent a good deal of time travelling backwards and forwards to the conflict, and some of the events I've drawn, some of the events on the ground, descriptions of conflict and so on, I've drawn from my own experiences. Not so what I'm about to read you is about the siege of Vukovar. So our key character, Marin Kadic, after years of living on the run, decides that he'll go and redeem himself by becoming a Croatian patriot. The siege of Vukovar is little known these days. But if you remember the wars that began in Yugoslavia, there was a city called Vukovar, which is a Croatian city on the border with Serbia. The Serbian president, Slobodan Milosevic, decided he would take this city. And very bravely, a small group of Croatian fighters, we're talking only a few thousand of them, hold out for nearly 4 or 5 months against the might of the Yugoslavian army. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of tanks. We're talking about Air Force dropping bombs on the town. We're talking about a massive artillery bombardment. It's something like the siege of Stalingrad, but on a smaller scale. And a small group of Croat fighters, is why I don't actually have a prejudice against Croats, because these guys were genuine heroes, stand out for a very long time against the Yugoslavian army, the might of the Yugoslavian army. Marin Kadic arrives in the middle of this fight. He comes in on a bus, and I guess we'll pick up where he wakes up in the morning on the first day of the worst part of the conflict. An earthquake woke Marin Kadic. Windows rattled in their frames, plates, cups and cutlery shivered and clattered on the wooden table. A faded tourist picture went askew on its hook. It showed an old monastery from the other side of the Danube. In his flimsy cot, Marin felt rumbling vibrations through the floor. Across the room, 2 boys threw aside their blankets and ran to the window. Peering through it, the dark-haired one cried, "Yebisa, fuck it." Fear raised the boy's voice a few octaves. The lad next to him leant forward, a hand on his friend's arm, with strands of dirty blonde hair hanging over his face, all the way to his gaping mouth. "Get back from the window," Marin yelled, for he had identified the sound now. As he struggled out of the cocoon of his sleeping bag, he felt a stab of sadness. They were just kids, volunteers who'd come with him last night on the almost empty armoured bus. The boys had huddled together as the bus took heavy fire on the cornfield road. He knew only that they'd grown up together and were still pupils at the same school. Their names were Vinko and Mirko, but he couldn't tell one from the other. "They're on top of us," the second boy struggled to get the words out. As Marin made for them, the boys turned and sprinted into the next room. From the edge of the second floor window, Marin saw a huge metal shape moving below and recognised the profile immediately. T-25, a main battle tank. Above the roar of its massive engine, the tracks were clanking and squealing as one side braked for the fast right-hand angle into Slavonska. Other tanks were queued up behind it, braking and jostling for space so as to make the same turn. Their hatches were down. The house was on the corner of Slavonska Street and Trepinska Road, the main route into the city. Trepinska was jammed with armour as far as he could see. He understood immediately that he was looking at the main thrust of the Serbian assault on Vukovar. The seemingly endless column of armoured vehicles was moving slowly, turrets swivelling as their long guns searched for targets. Over the mechanised roar, Marin heard a racket from the next room, boys shouting, a window thrust up. He rushed into the doorway to find the dark-haired boy at the open window, a long tube on his shoulder, an RPG loaded with a conical rocket. The boy was in the firing position, sighting down, knees bent, braced for the shot. Behind him, his friend shoved shanks of hair back over the top of his head to clear his eyes before shouting, "Now, now!" Marin threw up his arms. "No!" At that moment, the dark-haired boy depressed the trigger and a puff of black smoke spat from the back of the firing tube into the startled face of the blonde kid. Then came the explosion in the tube and a ball of flame and superheated air shot out the back, completely enveloping the boy's head. The boy screamed and went reeling crazily back across the room, his face seared by the blowback in the confined space. Marin saw the rocket spear out of the tube. A 45-degree shot into heavy armour at close range was unlikely to be effective. He ran forwards, crump. The air vibrated with the force of the explosion. Through the window, he saw a ball of smoke and flame rising above the turret of a T-25 that was halfway through its turn into Slavonska Street. Marin grabbed the shooter by the collar and hauled him back into the room. The boy went sprawling to the ground and dropped the weapon. His friend was screaming, hands up to the blackened, cooked skin on his face. "Get down and shut up," Marin shouted. He crouched and scuttled across the floor, pulling down the injured boy, who had severe burns on one side of his face that had welded his left eye shut. The kid was useless now and a liability. Marin grabbed the uninjured boy by the shoulders. "Which one are you?" he said. "Mirko." "Okay, Mirko. Wrap something around Vinko's face as fast as you can and keep him quiet. We've got to get out of here." He had no idea how long it would take for the tank crews to figure out where the attack had come from. There was a stash of arms in the room. He grabbed a Kalashnikov, slung it over his shoulder and filled his coat pockets with loaded mags. There were RPG rockets in an open box, high explosive warheads, but not the shaped charge rounds that could penetrate the armour of a tank. The boy's shot would have only caused superficial damage. He heard the hydraulics of the tank mechanism as the tank reacted in the street below. They had very little time. Mirko was trying to stifle his mate's screams. Then Marin saw two Zolyas leaning against the wall. Now that was a weapon that could do some damage. He grabbed one for himself, threw one to Mirko. "The RPG's no good," he hissed. "Take the Zolly." "I don't know how to use it," said the boy, his young face contorted with remorse. Marin hauled him up. "We've got to get out now." Together they hoisted up the injured boy. Vinko was whimpering in shock. His face was wrapped in a heavy metal T-shirt on which two screaming demons fought over a bell. Hell's bells. Marin was struck by the weirdness of it. AC fucking DC in Vukovar. They hauled Vinko out of the room, down the stairs, barely making it beyond the first flight when an explosion rent the air behind them. One of the tanks had fired point blank at the offending window. The shell exploded on the inner wall, taking out part of the roof along with it. Marin's ears rang and his head pounded as he dragged the boys towards the back door. Rubble and plaster rained down, making pale ghosts of them. The boys staggered like drunkards, but they couldn't stop moving. They made it out of the house as a second explosion brought down the rest of the roof and blew a cloud of debris through the doors and windows. Marin imagined the hot breath of a monster at their backs. Moving at a fast hobble, they made it through the backyards of half a dozen homes while the tanks continued to reduce the corner house to a pile of rubble. I thought this was like the 1812 overture, right? It'd wake you up.
We will come to questions. If you have one, please line up at the mic just here in front. While we're waiting for people, Tony, I thought Marin Kadich was actually a really tragic figure. He was sort of torn between his own personal beliefs, the history of his father, this terrible history of his father. Did you set out to put him in the middle of all of that?
Yes, I did. I wanted him to be a sort of sympathetic character who was caught between, as you say, his father's extremism and his own kind of idealism. And of course, he's also in love with a woman who's on the other side of the equation completely. And it's a series of terrible events in his life that kind of lead him to end up in the conflict. I won't sort of go into those because it's the things that happen that he can't escape from that lead him and Anna to become separated and lead him ultimately to be in a war crimes prison and her to try and rediscover him and try and find out what the hell has happened to this guy she was in love with in her early 20s.
I did love the real life characters popping up in the books. Paul Hogan, George Negus, and Slobodan Milosevic. I know it sounds like a joke, right? Paul Hogan, George Negus and Slobodan Milosevic walk into a bar, right? That was obviously a bit of fun for you to write.
Yeah, no, it was actually. So Ivo Kadic, who's the father of Marin Kadic, and he's the kind of Second World war criminal with connections to the Ustasha. He, in my book, is in the first book, he's a foreman on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So Marin knows the bridge very well and actually climbs all over it at a time before it was, before the recent terrorist threat in which they've put sensors all over it. And so you can no longer climb over the bridge except in an official capacity. But back in those days, in the 1970s, you could. And indeed, in one seminal scene, Marin takes Anna in their university days and they climb up the bridge together. And of course, that bridge is where Paul Hogan worked. So in exactly that period of time. So when she later goes to confront Ivo Kadic at the bridge, she meets Paul Hogan. It's a short scene, but a consequential meeting.
Questions?
Hello. I will. Tony, congratulations and thank you for a wonderful book. It is so well researched to the finest detail. I recognise those places and tastes. I come from that part of the world myself, and the question is, I know it's a little bit different from what you talked about, but it's very much about Bosnia and Herzegovina. What do you think is the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina under current structure? And will Dayton Accord last?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a terrible fear that it won't. There's a terrible fear that it won't because basically there's a sort of stalemate now where all the warring parties have sort of now fenced off from each other, and one hopes they'll never end up at each other's throats again. But it could happen at any time, to be honest with you. I was back in Bosnia a few years ago and in Sarajevo and other places, and what I discovered was that young people are terribly afraid that what's happened is a kind of pause and that the fighting could begin at any time. I mean, you don't get much news about it these days. And it's interesting. My character, Marin Kadic, has a connection to Bosnia because although his father is a Croatian member of the old Ustasha, his mother was Bosnian and a Muslim. And so he's torn himself between these two kind of warring parts of his own genetics and his own background. And he finds his mother during the course of the two novels. It helps him to understand the truth about his father, in fact, because the mother and father have been separated for many years. But I think and I fear that those old conflicts are still not resolved.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much for a great book, Tony, and a great session this morning. My question is about how these groups got involved in Australian politics. My understanding is that Srecko Rover was a member of the Liberal Party, and his influence was very great in Australia. He also got a lot of those young moustachie lads trained in the Australian Army, and during the fall of Yugoslavia, went back and helped with ethnic cleansing during that time. So he's a terrible war criminal, apart from what he did in World War II. But also there's Lenko Urbanic, who was the head of the Dobromans in Slovenia, which was the pro-Nazi group there. He headed up the Ethnic Affairs Council of the Liberal Party of New South Wales.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Lenko Urbanic, it was in the Slovenian Domobranci, which was a kind of, it was a bit like the Ustasha, but operating in Slovenia. He was not an active fighter. What he was a propagandist for the Domobranci. Domobranci is basically a Nazi organisation, and they had their own newspaper. And Lenko Urbanic wrote, Goebbels-like diatribes against Jews. They are the rats coming up from the gutters, to destroy us all. He ends up, you're absolutely right, the head of the Ethnic Council, the New South Wales Liberal Party, and a senior figure in what they call the Uglies. That is to say, the right wing of the New South Wales Liberal Party. I don't know about Rover being a member of the Liberal Party, but I do know that many people suspect he had deep connections with ASIO.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to ask. My understanding was that Peter Barber, I think the first or one of the first directors of ASIO, actually employed Nazi war criminals to spy on unionists, peace activists and so on, left-wingers.
That's a core part of Mark Aaron's work, actually.
Yes.
He demonstrated that in a number of cases. And actually, the Labor Party believed that passionately in the lead up to the Whitlam government coming to power. As I've said, there was the bombing in Sydney that they believe was committed by the same people, and it led Lionel Murphy, the Attorney General, to raid ASIO, the famous raid in March of 1973, which incidentally happened only days before the arrival in Australia of the Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, Mr. Bijedic, who our Commonwealth Police firmly believed there was an assassination attempt afoot to kill him when he arrived in Australia. And that's actually the core underpinning, really, of the first book, The 20th Man. So we go with Lionel Murphy on his raid on ASIO, for example, and I spent a good deal of time, I've made that as realistic as possible because I spent a good deal of time speaking to people who were in ASIO at the time, who were with Murphy on the raid, and I think my account of it is almost like true history, except that there are some fictional characters, in and around the story. But it's such a compelling, weird story in itself. It has that sort of thriller element of him racing down from Canberra, sending in the Commonwealth Police to lock down his own security organisation. A shock in Australia, but a shock that sent waves of repercussions right across the intelligence world. So the CIA, for example, never trusted the Whitlam government after that.
Thank you. Next question.
Tony, thank you for your two beautiful books. I love both of them. And what's not to love? You've got politics, history and a love story in those two books. But I wanted to ask you, we've all seen you had another life as you were doing this. How did you put together your public life and the writing? Not just the process, but, that was a big thing to do two things like that at once.
Well, you just have to find spare time. writing these days is actually a lot easier because it's pretty much my main function as a human being. I've given up the Q&A program, as I say, expecting to be in China. So the third novel is going to be a lot easier to write. I have much more time to do it. And I'm also, incidentally, Sarah and I will be writing together a book about the documentary series, which you should all watch, Revelation, coming up in coming weeks on the ABC. It's the fruit of an incredible amount of work done by Sarah and her team over the past few years, and there'll be a book coming out subsequently, the Book of Revelation.
For those at the back who don't know, Sarah is sitting in the front row. I think she deserves a round of applause because she is our premier investigative journalist.
Seriously, stay tuned for that.
It's in the diary. Any other questions? I've got a few more. Feel free, we have time for another couple. So what is the next book about?
Okay, so I'm taking a bit of a departure from the work that I did, but again, I'm sort of inspired by something that happened in my past. So when I was at university, I was in a college at Sydney University called St Paul's. David Marr, who's here tomorrow, was also there. Gough Whitlam was there, as I mentioned earlier.
Not at the same time.
Not at the same time, no. Well, he might have been there with David. We should ask David that. No, I'm being mean. It's funny, when you walk the halls of St Paul's College, there are photographs everywhere, and you can wander around spotting people like Gough Whitlam, Billy McMahon, David Marr in the photographs of the college boys. But the dark side of my experience there was a murder that happened and a homicide investigation that moved in a kind of Agatha Christie way into the cloistered environment of the university college. It was it was an event that you never forget. And so I'm based upon that, but not using that exact event. I've decided to write a kind of murder story in a college.
Who was killed?
It was a young woman who was murdered on the side of the college oval, and it's an unsolved murder, a horrific murder. But, you know, when you live... She was the girlfriend of one of the guys in the college, and she was on her way to visit him. And as I say, they never found the murderer. Most likely, there were a whole series of theories about, you know, people wandering around the campus at the time. But because of the connection with the college, the homicide detectives came in and interviewed everybody.
Including you?
Including me, yeah. I was there at the time. I remember it very well because a friend had given me a chicken, like a newly hatched chicken. It was part of a psychology experiment.
I thought you were going to say a rubber chicken.
No, an actual chicken. So chickens bond with the first, warm-blooded creature they see, and my friend went away and left me with this chicken, and it bonded with me. It was sitting under my bed when the homicide detective came. And when he was interviewing me, it came and ran around my feet, this little yellow chicken, and it was, I just remember this being extremely weird, and he clearly thought it was weird. I don't know what he wrote in his notes, but I'd love to see them one day. Anyway, that's one of the strange things that happened. There were many weird things that happened during that period, but I'm kind of drawn in these experiences to write a kind of murder mystery that has a political connection as well.
Okay, and when is that due out?
Well, I've still got to write it, okay. So...
there must be a due date. Come on, I know how publishers work.
No, there's no due date at the moment.
Okay.
No.
Stay tuned for that one.
Stay tuned.
Another question.
Thank you. Tony, my concern is about the future of the ABC. It's well loved, and I'm very, very worried about the deep budget cuts. The type of work the ABC does, only the ABC can do in terms of exposing corruption and maladministration and all of that with respect to whether it's Australian politics or at a state level. So I'll be interested in to know your views on that. And lastly, the issue of, like on Q&A, why do you tolerate politicians on that program when they don't answer a question? Why not just shut them up and say, look, Minister or whoever, you're not answering the question, you're not being helpful, you're off. Just, you're off.
Do you want to come clean, Ralph Clark?
I beg your pardon?
Do you want to come clean, Ralph Clark?
Oh, well, I was a politician, but...
Well, shut up.
And a very verbose one.
That's enough of you.
And I did dodge it a question or two.
No, thanks for the question. As to the Q&A thing, well, that's the responsibility of someone else primarily now, so I'll let Hamish deal with that one. And in the weeks and months and years ahead, we'll see whether he finds it easier than other incumbents in that seat to do that. It's very hard to shut up politicians. Actually chucking them off the panel is, it's actually a unique idea, and perhaps someone should try that in the future. But what Tony Abbott did was just refuse to allow them to come on the panel when he was Prime Minister. So we didn't really get the opportunity to question a lot of ministers or senior ministers for a long time on the program for that reason. As to the ABC budget cuts, well, they're horrific, and we're about to find what they really mean, because until now, they haven't really kicked in. But in the next year, in the coming year or so, we're going to see cuts all over the place. And every person that I know that works in the ABC, and every unit, every program will suffer. They've suffered over many years from a series of cuts. I was with some friends last night, actually, who worked on Four Corners many years ago when the resources were not a problem. And the program, although the program's maintained a very high level, at that stage, we never really thought we've never thought twice about, there's been an explosion on a Greenpeace vessel in New Zealand. Go now. Something's happened in some part of the world. Go now. Now, these days, things happen, and, you'll have to go through 20 different departments to try and drum up the money and the approvals to go anywhere. It's a very different place than when I started. It's a place that's living under a pall of fear about these cuts. A lot of people are worried about the future of their jobs, and a lot of people will lose their jobs in the coming months. And I think it's a terrible shame and a terrible thing for democracy.
Lucky last question, Fontella.
Thank you, Tony, for the wonderful, amazing session today. As an ex-journo, and just hearing you talk about the ABC cuts, and yesterday we had the announcement of AAP. Just wondering how you feel with what's coming and the status of journalism. I must confess I am an ex-journo. The status of journalism in Australia and what it might mean moving forward, particularly for our democracy.
I feel very sad for young journalists. I mean, I've described to you the series of, let's say, unfortunate or fortunate events that led me to become a journalist. I was incredibly lucky. It's still a very difficult thing to do. When we applied to become a trainee in the ABC, there were still hundreds and hundreds of other people applying. But these days, it's almost impossible to get those kind of jobs. There are a tiny number of them. They're filled very quickly from, thousands and thousands of applicants. So getting into the ABC as a journalist these days, very difficult. Getting into the ABC as a trainee, getting into the ABC as an experienced journalist is slightly easier. So if you've got a proven track record of journalism, lots of newspaper journalists have come to work on the ABC in recent years. As their newspapers have closed down or reduced their operations so significantly that they aren't doing what they used to do. I actually think I'm somewhat optimistic that new technology will find pathways for people to get information out. But I think as a career, journalism is becoming increasingly difficult. And my own son has just finished university, and we were talking about this the other day. And in the end, I could only say, try and get a job on a local newspaper or work on a community radio station and see whether you can get some experience. Because the only people who get jobs in journalism these days be journalists, people who've already got a proven track record. So for young people, I feel quite depressed about the prospects. Nonetheless, Four Corners is still going, 7:30 Report's still going, Q&A's still going. The core programs of the ABC will keep going, but at a reduced level in each case. So it's up to you guys, really, to let the politicians know that's unacceptable.
We're out of time. Before I wrap up, I would just make an announcement for those who haven't caught up. The next session has been changed. Yung Chang couldn't travel to Australia, to Adelaide. The next session is how does Adelaide keep up with George Megalogenis? It's going to challenge us all to think about, with the growth of Melbourne, what do we do as a city to remain relevant? I think having events like this is one way. Please thank Tony Jones.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Beautifully done, Victoria.
Oh.